Roger and I were just talking a few minutes ago about this cover of National Geographic. I bought it in the airport in Boston last month because it was such a fetching cover. And he suggested that someone had taken off the question mark after the title, right? What's up with the weather? Is there anything up with the weather? One of the big challenges of our times is how we respond and face extremes in nature and also extreme events in our science and technological events. Several people in the room are experts in this subject, including our panelists. I see Kathleen Tierney and others who, Randy Dole, who just spoke in our center series this last spring about attribution of extreme weather events to different causes, including global warming. You know that in some ways, the question is simple. Oh, gee, nature and our own technology throws us surprises, and we need to learn to deal with them. But in other ways, it gets really complicated. What's the cause? Is it us or is it nature? There's a notion that the weather is weird, but when we listened really intently to Randy talk this spring, he reminded us how difficult it is for science to unequivocally attribute weirdness to the weather. The weather's always weird, which is what the photo editors of National Geographic get away with suggesting. But if it's always weird, then it's never weird. We really have struggles with where are the sources of our vulnerability, why there are increasing losses. The next graph there is the billion-dollar weather events that NOAA released this year, suggesting that when we look at losses in the United States from weather and climate extremes, that they're increasing. Why is that? I think most people in the room have a sense of this, that we put much more at risk, but let's let our panelists hold forth. And it isn't just weather and climate. In these global numbers of increasing disasters and losses, even in detrended dollars, there's both weather and climate, but increased losses from natural extremes that probably aren't trending in any way, like earthquakes and volcanoes. So our panelists, and let me introduce first, and I'll just quickly introduce them. We'll let them do a round, interact with each other, and then we'll have the questions in the audience. And we've got enough time to explore this issue in some detail. Shali Mohleji, excuse me, gee, one of our students, our former students, is now a visiting fellow of the American Meteorological Society Policy Program in Washington, D.C. Got her bachelor's degree in environmental sciences at the University of Virginia, and her master's degree in atmospheric sciences at Purdue, and her PhD from here. We're just really excited to have Shali over at the American Meteorological Society's policy program in Washington, working with Bill Hook and others. Roger Pielke is the founding director of the Center for Science and Technology Policy Research in Ceres, a professor of environmental studies and fellow of Ceres. His focus is on, his research work is on extremes and society, innovation, and politics. He also studies the governance of sports and blogs extensively on climate change, science, technology, innovation, and sports, including this thing called FIFA, which is... He's co-author of several books. I'll just recommend two of them to you. The Honest Broker, which explores issues of the role of science in setting policy and advising policy, which is a theme that we'll be carrying on all day, and especially this evening with Dr. Holdren. And his most recent book is The Climate Fix, What Scientists and Politicians Won't Tell You About Global Warming. Kevin Vranes, another one of our alums, is with eSource, Energy Management Services, has a decade of experience working in greenhouse gas and climate change issues, and especially more recently in efforts among large businesses and corporate ecosystems to reduce their carbon footprint. Was a senior legislative staffer in Washington, D.C. in Ron Wyden's office. Worked, for instance, on the Energy Policy Act in 2005, holds a PhD in geophysics from Columbia, and was a public policy fellow at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs, besides being a student here at Boulder, and now with eSource in Boulder. And should we just use that order to go? Take it away, Shali.
Sure. Is this on? Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yes.
Yeah. Speak right into the microphone.
Is that better? Okay. Just out of curiosity, before I get started, I was curious to know in the audience, are there people here who are from NOAA? A couple NOAA employees? Anybody here from National Weather Service? The Boulder WFO, by chance? No. And how many people here from the university itself? Okay, that's a good sense. The reason I ask is because the two things that I would like to mention when it comes to extreme events are two distinctions that I've sort of seen come to the surface I think are useful in considering, especially in the policy arena for extreme events. The first one is a distinction I'd like to make between climate extreme events and weather extreme events. And so I ask that because it deals a lot with, what NOAA's looking at as a whole agency as opposed to National Weather Service. The other one that I'll talk about, a little bit later is a distinction between the physical science impacts of extreme events or the physical science characteristics of extreme events versus the impacts. And that's a distinction that I think is worth discussing a little bit when talking about extreme events. So the first one, talking a little bit about climate extremes versus weather extremes. Let me tell you a little bit about how the federal government is looking at those two issues. So I work in Washington, D.C. in the AMS policy program, and one of the benefits is that we get to work with agencies on topical issues. So I work on extreme events with NOAA and with the National Weather Service. So with NOAA, kind of agency-wide, there is, some of you from NOAA might know, the NOAA Next Generation Strategic Plan. And this is kind of an overarching mission of NOAA to better serve society through their science. And they kind of want to use that as a vision for all the science going on in the agency. And one specific program within NOAA is called the Climate and Societal Interactions Program, CSI. And CSI specifically has been designed to look at climate adaptation and mitigation issues. And so they have kind of 4 topical issues within CSI. They're interested in looking at weather and extreme events as 1, marine ecosystems as 2, coastal resilience, and water resources. And so I bring that up because that's where a lot of this, attention to NOAA on extreme events is taking place, is in the CSI program. The distinction is, though, in that program, NOAA is really interested in extreme events relative to climate. And so these are long-term trends in extreme events. This, as opposed to National Weather Service, who is another group that I work with, where they're interested in extreme weather events. And so there's a difference there. So at NOAA, they're really interested in long-term trends and kind of one of the defining timeframes is, 30-plus years when you're looking at climate trends, whereas National Weather Service is very interested in specific individual events. So for instance, the Joplin tornadoes, May 22nd, 2011, those tornadoes those were considered an extreme weather event. They clocked in maximum wind speeds greater than 200 miles per hour. That's something the National Weather Service is interested in looking at, what was behind those winds being so extreme, more than what you might see in other EF5s. But National Weather Service is not really looking at long-term trends, which is something NOAA is looking at. The reason that I think this distinction is important is because in the policy discussions we're having in DC, there's a lot of conflation of the two of them. And the reason that this concerns me a little bit is when you start confusing some of these long-term trends and climate extreme events with weather extreme events, sometimes you might end up having some misinformation come out of it. So attributing individual events, to say if you follow some of the news coverage of the Joplin tornadoes, there were a lot of questions in the newspaper of, is this climate change? Is this an effect of climate change? That is, I think, a valid question to be asking, but I don't think that that's the discussion that's as useful at this moment when you're talking about policy considerations for extreme events. There are better ways to kind of frame things. If you think about policy as decisions, and you think about public policy as decisions for society, we're basically trying to come up with decisions and solutions to things like extreme events. When you start, mixing these kinds of things together and talking about individual events with long-term trends and things like that, it's very difficult to really pinpoint what the problem is, how to attribute the source of this, and trying to figure out how to better deal with them. So just very briefly, that's kind of one issue that I've seen surface, and it's something of concern enough that NOAA itself has gotten involved in trying to talk about the discussion itself, the narrative going forward on extreme events and these kinds of confusion of issues. How can we better, as scientists, how can we inform that dialogue better going forward so that we can avoid some of this miscommunication, misinformation of conflating these two issues together. So that's one thing I'm working on in DC. The other issue that I would briefly talk about is the distinction between the physical science of extreme events versus the impact. And I won't say too much because we kind of have the king of disaster impacts sitting up here, so I'm sure he'll discuss that a little bit. But just kind of very briefly, the idea of that is to distinguish between the science parameters behind an extreme event, the amount of precipitation coming down, with certain storms, or the temperatures that are actually being recorded for a heat wave. Those are the actual physical science characteristics of an extreme event, as opposed to the damage caused by the event. And so there's been some confusion and kind of conflating those two issues as well. And again, I find that a little bit concerning going forward in policy discussions because, when you're trying to find the root of the problem to figure out how to deal with it, those are two very different issues. And so, for instance, again, the Joplin event has, Weather Service does, label that as an extreme event because of the physical parameters, the wind gusts that were on there were extreme for what a tornado would be. But, if you read or you talk to people, a lot of times they'll say Katrina was an extreme event, and that's not really the case when you look at the physical science parameters of what was behind that hurricane. So there's some, confusion on what's an extreme event, what's not, and, to be honest, I think that the SREX report, if you all are familiar with that, that's the IPCC's recent report for on extreme events, that's confusing as well. And so, I understand where some of this confusion comes from. I looked it up, just to try to figure it out, where they are. They define extreme events as events where the value of the event, any kind of a scientific parameter of it, the value of a weather or climate variable is above or below a threshold. So that's simply, in my mind, talking about the physical science characteristics. Chapter 3, which is, the chapter that I think a lot of us who are in the disaster community looked at, and specifically section 3.1.2, if you want to go back and look at the report. That talks about the physical science variables of an extreme event. That's how they're defining it, to talk about, what are, the water levels or the temperatures or things like that. But then you've got chapter 4 following that, which is all about impact. And so I'm not saying that these are not, one is important, one's not. They're both equally important, but they're two very different discussions, and they're two very different sides of extreme events to look at. And so my concern is when they're getting kind of jumbled up together in that discussion, and you see 160 events in 2012 as being labeled extreme events, I would wonder if that's actually 160 events that took place that had science variables, physical science variables that were beyond, the threshold. It might be. We're still looking through it with National Weather Service to see, what each event was. But, when you talk about the policy implications of things like that, the decision maker who has to figure out how do we make the communities more resilient to extreme events, the first thing they're going to ask is how bad is the problem? And they want to know the trends, they want to know the numbers. And so these types of issues are important to distinguish when you're trying to get your data down of how many were there, are they getting worse, why are they getting worse? Is it an issue of the damage, which is, one side of the problem of exposure, vulnerability and things, or is it an issue of, actual events that are getting, heat waves that are getting hotter and things like that? So I'll just kind of leave it at that for right now as kind of the two issues that I see, and if there are questions, you can follow up and we can talk about it a little bit more.
So we have the panelists go, and then then you can respond to each other, and then we'll have at it.
All right, I guess I'm up next. Thanks, Bill. Let me start by saying Shali said something very nice about me, called me the king of climate impacts, but I'll just point out on an email exchange with some of our alums last week, she was comparing me to the monkey who accompanies the organ grinder. So
Which one fits better?
Yeah, that's all right.
I'll let you be the judge of that. So before I start talking about extreme events, I do want to say a few things about this event. It's remarkable to me that it's 10 years that we've had our center here, and that I remember when we first started, my daughter was going to preschool at Mapleton Montessori in North Boulder. Now she's just down at Boulder High School, below where our center sits. So time goes by. There's a few people to thank. First, Bill. Bill's in his last year as our director, and he's been a great director and has set us up great for whatever comes next. Also, Ceres. Ceres has been a great supporter of our center. in a time when the university has not seen increasing budgets, particularly from the state, and without Ceres support, we would not have any of the successes that we've had. I also want to thank Susan Avery, who's here sitting in the front row, who really was the visionary who thought that, hey, maybe it's a good idea to have some people thinking about policy and social science in Ceres. And when Susan and I first started talking about that, maybe as long as 12 or 13 years ago, I would have to say it was not universally accepted in Ceres that we ought to be going in the direction of policy. And today that, I think, has changed, that we have a lot of friends and support all across Ceres. And finally, I want to thank Bobby Klein and Amy Naku-Schmidt, who I think are sitting over there, who, if anyone represents our center, it's those two who put all of this stuff together. And when you see our wonderful webpage, that's really the heart and soul of our center, so thanks. In my comments, I'm going to make 3 points, and hopefully this will provoke a discussion after we're all done up here. The first one is that societal responses to extreme events, and let me be precise, we often use extreme events to mean all sorts of things. And by extreme events, I mean societally impacting events like earthquakes, floods, tropical cyclones, tornadoes, and so on. The societal responses to events such as these is one of the great success stories in science and technology and in policy over the last century. If you take a look at data on loss of life related to extremes around the world, particularly drought, the ability of society to mitigate those impacts has been remarkable. And I'm going to go through an example quickly. I'll go through the 2012 U.S. drought, which you're all familiar with, you've all heard about. This year, U.S. corn production is the 8th highest ever. United States farmers have had their most profitable year ever. Globally, grain production, and by that I mean wheat, rice, and corn, is at an all-time record high in 2012. The 2012 U.S. drought has been compared in terms of, as Shali said, the physical science characteristics to the 1988 drought, which many of us remember. But if you look at the economic impacts as a proportion of the U.S. economy, the level of impact of the 2012 drought is about 10% of the 1988 drought. All of this represents better decision-making, better policy, more robustness, more resilience. It's something we don't see and we don't tout very often, but the community of people in policy, in research, and importantly in this connection of research and policy really has done a great job over the last century, and it's probably as significant as the Green Revolution has been to agriculture in the area of disasters. My second point, so I'm going to say basically the opposite. At the same time, our societal vulnerabilities to extreme events is changing, and we remain at considerable risks to losses. Policy responses to extreme events are not the sort of things where you can rest on your laurels and say, oh, we've done such a great job, we've obviously solved that problem. And I could go through many examples, I'll just give you a few. The 2011 floods in Bangkok, in Thailand, were not anomalous from a historical climatological standpoint. They had big floods in 1947 and earlier, but what they revealed was that the exposure the world now has to extreme events like this due to the globalization of supply chains. So for those of you who are of the sort that sits outside of Apple computer stores to wait for their latest iPhone, Apple supply chain was horribly disrupted by these floods because a lot of their parts are manufactured in Thailand. It turns out that a lot of the multinational corporations who insure against extreme events did not realize they had this risk on their books because they did not drill down to the level of, well, what happens if there's a flood in Thailand and it disrupts one of our suppliers? That's the kind of second, third, fourth order effect that our big, complicated, globalized society now has for extreme events. So the economic impact, the loss of life in the Bangkok floods was certainly tragic and large, but not terribly large in the history of extreme events. But its effect on the global economy was disproportionate and certainly opened a lot of folks' eyes to new vulnerabilities that we face due to extreme events. The Fukushima nuclear disaster followed the Honshu earthquake. The earthquake in Japan was itself a huge, huge tragedy, loss of life, tremendous damage. But I want to focus on Fukushima. The aftermath of that event has to do with building a nuclear power plant in a way that was not particularly resilient to flooding. They had their backup power generator sitting next to their main power generator at the same elevation in the same place, so they both got wiped out at the same time. But that has had long-lasting political repercussions, certainly in Japan, but also in Germany, where Germany has all of a sudden become one of the largest, they're seeing the largest increase in coal power of any country in Europe and certainly worldwide, because they're rushing to get out of nuclear power, and that means they have to rely more on coal. The 2012 U.S. drought showed us something about the consequences of what happens when we reduce resilience in our food systems. And what I'm referring to is the U.S. ethanol mandate. So we take 40% of the corn we produce in the United States and turn it into liquid fuel to put into cars. The reason we do this is because we are so spectacularly productive in how we produce corn that we have to do something with all that corn. And the U.S. Congress decided that, well, if we start putting it into cars, that will help increase demand and keep prices high, keep farmers happy. But it turns out when you have a drought that wipes out 10% of your production, all of a sudden that 40% you're devoting to liquid fuels looks a lot different than it did when there were times of plenty. Now this is made more complicated because what you would call resilience in food systems can be contrary to keeping farmers happy and well paid, and then there's political consequences that fall from that. So very quickly you see that extreme events are not just about extreme events, particularly these days, and they're tightly coupled to our complex globalized world. The third topic, so extreme events are an inkblot test at the interface of science and society. And by that, I'm of course referring to this hyper-politicized debate over climate change. So let me just say that the science of extreme events, and if we're talking about trends either in the physical quantities or the societal impacts, it's not complicated. It involves skills such as counting and reading comprehension. It should not be an area where there's much scientific controversy. Yes, there's different approaches, and yes, it can be difficult going into messy data and you have to adjust it and so on, but it's not something that should be controversial in our scientific community. Yet, despite that, the amount of nonsense on this subject boggles the mind on a daily basis, especially because a lot of the nonsense comes from people who otherwise would assert the authority of science in political debates. This quote showed up in my email this morning, and so I put it in my, it was said yesterday, so I put it in my presentation. And you'll figure out who it's from, and then I'll talk about it. So here's the quote. Down in Tennessee, we have an old saying. If you see a turtle on top of a fence post, you can be pretty sure it didn't get there by itself. If you see a turtle on top of every 10 fence posts, something's going on. These are turtles on the fence posts. These are the once-in-a-thousand-year events which come along every 2 years now. These are the kind of conditions that are associated with the droughts and the big floods and the fires and the stronger storms. This is reality. This is happening now. Now this is of course Al Gore, and he's starting up a new initiative called Dirty Weather, which they're going to highlight all of the extreme events over the past year as a consequence of human-caused climate change. I don't really mind politicians who politicize science. It's kind of in their mandate. That's their job. But what people like Al Gore and other advocates do is they create a fulcrum for the scientific community, for the media, and for government. They force a reaction. And let me tell you what actually the science of counting turtles actually says. So on climate timescales, these are timescales of 30 years to 50 years and longer. Here's what the IPCC, the Climate Change Science Program, have concluded. U.S. Midwestern drought has decreased in frequency and intensity. Hurricane landfalls, at least over the last century, have remained constant. Right now, the U.S. is in the longest stretch with no Category 3 or stronger storm making landfall in history. More than 7 years. It's remarkable how much luck we've had, and I will call it luck. Tornado damage, whether you adjust it for wealth or not, has decreased dramatically since 1950. Arguably, so too has tornado incidents in the U.S. Flood damage in the U.S. has declined precipitously as a fraction of the economy, and there's no evidence from measures of stream flow that actual U.S. floods have increased. Much can be said similarly at the global level. This is not, again, complicated. It's not rocket science. This shouldn't be controversial because this has been reported by the IPCC and the U.S. Climate Change Science Program, which are held up as the kind of the gold standard for assessments, even though they do sometimes have problems. Extreme events are the one area, I think, where you can faithfully report the consensus of the scientific community and be labeled a climate denier. Now, what I think is important about this topic is not so much the science of extremes, but what it tells us about politics and the politicization of science, particularly how the media chooses to handle the issue, how policymakers choose to handle the issue, and how we, most importantly, from where I sit, how we as so-called experts decide to handle this issue. And if you take a look at the kind of the ecosystem of the climate debate, you'll see that there's all sorts of responses where arguably some people are talking about politics when they're talking about science, and I'd be happy to engage and talk about this subject. I don't expect it to change going forward. My biggest concern is for the integrity of our scientific institutions. If we get excited in the froth over turtles on fences and dirty weather, some of our credibility and authority might be at risk. So just to summarize, extreme events are a success story, a great success story. At the same time, they are arguably a huge vulnerability to our modern society, and they're also an ink blot for us to think more generally about the role of science in decision making. Thanks.
Thanks, Roger. Kevin.
Hi. Excuse me. Good morning. Nice to see some of you again. Before I start, I need to ask if there's anybody from eSource that made it over here. Anybody from my company made it over here? Okay, good. I'm definitely going to alter what I'm going to say based on that. So, I've been in the private sector for a few years now, so I'm kind of a little bit out of the game, but still tracking it and still occasionally publishing papers in this world. And so a recent paper that that I was on was covering New York City drought, and it's very much relevant to this, but I'll get to that in a second. I would say that because I've been in the private sector for a while, not really in the academic loop on this, I really struggled about what I was going to say here and if I even had anything interesting to say. And actually, you'll be the judge of that when I'm done, and you'll probably say no. But I was thinking about the actual topic. Can we go back to that one slide that had the sheet or the agenda or whatever it was? There we go. So I was looking at the words extremes, nature, society, and policy, and just I took those 4 words in my mind and kind of moved them around a bunch in different ways and put them in different orders. And you can try to figure out how many different permutations there are. But I was thinking the one thing that keeps coming back to my mind when I think about those 4 words together is Charles Perrault's book, Normal Accidents. So I want to know if anybody's actually read that book, because it was published in the early 70s. Wow, like 4 people, 5 people. So have you read it recently? Recently?
My students have.
Okay, so did he predict Fukushima 40 years in advance? I mean, there's no prediction. I use that word intentionally just to see if I get a reaction out of you guys. The point of the book is when you have hugely complex systems with lots of interdependent variables that affect each other in nonlinear ways, and you have a lot of unpredictability in the system. One key component of systems like that are extreme, catastrophic, very rare, but very horribly catastrophic events. So he gave a lot of examples in his book, one of which was the 3 Mile Island disaster. And he goes into some detail about the kind of the hindsight problem, the hindsight fallacy of 3 Mile Island. Okay, so a huge event happens and you go in and you say, okay, let's get a blue ribbon panel and commission and study this whole thing. Let's publish a 400-page report and let's figure out why we could have prevented what we should have seen coming. And in the end, he says, no, that's all BS. You really couldn't, because what ended up happening in the end were 6 key events that all laid on top of each other in a perfect way. There's no way you could have known that those 6 events were going to lay on top of each other and have a domino effect in the way that they did. And that's really what led to the ultimate disaster, which in some senses I'm sure can be said about Fukushima as well. In the after analysis, 2 years down the line, when they study it like crazy, they're going to say, okay, this is what happened. We had an earthquake, we had a tsunami, and then the following 16 things happened in order after the tsunami hit. And if those 16 things hadn't happened, we wouldn't have had nearly the catastrophe that we had. And that can be seen throughout a lot of different examples, whether you're talking about an economy the size of the United States, or the crash in 2008, the stock market crash. Did Lehman Brothers cause the economic collapse? No, of course not. There were so many system problems spread throughout the system that maybe Lehman Brothers actually precipitated a domino effect that led to the ultimate, well, it wasn't really a collapse, but a couple of year recession. But you know, those things happen. Those things are natural parts of the system. So as a policymaker, what do you do? You know, if you're faced with this as a policymaker, do you say, well, we throw up our hands and there's nothing we can do? No, and I think you don't do that. And what we've done is pretty appropriate, and we keep using the words resilience and resistance. And so I worked on a project in where we went down to Venezuela and helped the Venezuelan government build a disaster-resistant, what we call a disaster-resistant Caracas, which is the capital city of Venezuela, the largest city. Caracas has what I would say is far more scientific vulnerability in Shali's scientific sense to extreme events than we are used to in most places in the United States because of the geology and the way the geology intersects with their climate and their climatology. A lot of extreme rain events, and they're surrounded by very steep-sided mountains that will come down in debris flows at a moment's notice. Yet they've still built entire cities, entire communities on top of alluvial fans spread throughout the region, both in the capital city basin and on the other side, on the Caribbean side. What I've realized since then, doing that project and since then, is that being able to build in resilience and build in disaster resistance is a luxury, and it's a luxury of wealth. And the United States has done fairly well at it. But other countries like Iran and Venezuela and Bangladesh and other countries like that have not, because they don't have the resources to do it. They don't have the time, they don't have the energy, and they don't have the money. And so when an earthquake, a fairly moderate, shallow earthquake happens in Iran, 30,000 people die. And when the same exact earthquake happens in San Francisco, we may have $100 billion in losses, but we may only have 100 people die. Now, you can ask yourself if that's a success or not, and it depends on your outlook and depends on your goals as a policymaker. If your goals were, I want to prevent loss of life, but I don't really care about the economic problems or the economic effects, then I guess you were successful. And one question I would pose is, did we actually make that choice consciously? Did we go into that as policymakers saying, all right, I can see that there's a trade-off. I can build in a lot of expensive resilience here. And so when I do have an extreme event, which I can't really see coming, I know they're out there, I can't really see them coming. So I'm going to build in some resilience. I'm going to spend a lot of money on it. So when I do have this extreme event, and I do have the 1906 earthquake happen again, the exact same shaking happen again, I know it's going to cost me $100 to $300 billion, yet I'm going to save tens of thousands of people's lives. Is that a trade-off I'm making consciously, or is that just something that happened to happen? I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. I don't think there's actually any answer to that question at all. It's just something to throw out there. I think I'll leave it at that, and we can talk now. Oh, actually, I did have one more point, thanks. See, I didn't have any written notes. Like I said, I was struggling with what I was going to talk about, so I didn't, in the end, didn't write anything down at all. To Roger's point about the debate, I'm tracking something very interesting that's starting to come on now. It's been out there for a few years now, but it's really starting to ramp up now. And it's where I see the climate debate headed in terms of substituting values for, you know, everybody probably knows Roger's whole values as a proxy for science, or science as a proxy for values. Anyway, it's the energy efficiency debate, and I know it well now because that's what I'm working on right now with utilities and large corporations. There's in energy efficiency policy, there's a term called the rebound effect, which some of you may know as Jevons paradox. And there's a very hot debate right now, just right under the scene, right under the covers, about whether the rebound effect actually exists or not. And if it does exist, how large is it, and how much does it matter? And I'll just outline the kind of the boundaries of this right now, so you can start tuning into it and tracking it yourself, because you're definitely going to start hearing about it. Because I think people are getting a little bit tired of talking about climate science, so they're going to talk about this now. So here's the idea. If you create a class of products that are, I'm going to probably butcher Jevons paradox, but if you create a class of products that are more efficient, let's say refrigerators, you actually bring the cost of ownership and the cost of operations down enough that you open the ability to buy that and use that item to more people. So in the end, more people buy them, and in the end, instead of less energy usage, you actually get more energy usage. Now, in certain parts of the economic system, this is actually, I think, fairly robust and fairly well known that this actually exists. The question is, does it exist on society as a whole, or economy-wide? So if you were the DOE, if you pushed out energy efficiency really aggressively throughout the economic system, would you in turn see an increase in energy usage? Because you're just making energy usage more efficient, so you're opening it up to more uses and to more people using it. That is an open question right now, but what's really interesting is to look at the people who are debating it right now. So there's been plenty of op-eds in the Washington Post and the LA Times, the New York Times about this. EPRI is a research institute out of Palo Alto that talks about this all the time. It's already coming down very strongly on liberal and conservative political lines. So on the liberal side, and I'm making generalizations, but I feel like this is pretty robust. On the liberal side, you have those saying, no, there's no rebound effect, or if there is, it's very, very small, so let's do more energy efficiency. On the conservative side, you have the opposite argument. There's a very large rebound effect, and government should not be putting their hands into this because they're just making the problem worse. So I'm throwing that out there now. Does it have to do with extremes in society? No, it doesn't, but I think it actually informs the debate on climate extremes in society. It's a very similar debate, and it's kind of rolling out in a similar way. So with that, I will pass it back to you.
Thanks, Kevin. When I ran over here at 9 o'clock, I left my students over in the hazard seminar grappling with a version of this, which is the dismal version of Charles Perrow's normal accident theory. And they're in groups now. I hope they're still, I don't know if they're still over there. They're in groups. They're reporting back next Tuesday. What happens when you try to make things better? And in hazards, I'll tell you the example. They're looking at the Boulder Hazard Mitigation Plan. It's under review right now. We're going through our 5-year review of our Community Hazard Mitigation Plan. But they're looking at the previous one. And the previous one strongly tried to reduce fire hazard on the west side of Boulder and strongly urged more prescribed burns to do it. So the students are grappling with the problem of if you choose that mitigation approach, prescribed burns, one of them will get away from you and will cause some damage. This happened in the lower North Fork in March, just south of Denver this year. It also killed 3 people, and there are legal and other implications. The other option, and in the plan, is mechanical treatment. You go in there and you cut a bunch of trees down. It's really expensive because there's not much value to the trees. So they're sorting out the dismal theorem of Chick Perrow's work, which is do you, with levees, dams, fire mitigation, do the solutions become the problem? Not always, we don't know, but thanks for raising both of those. The panelists want to respond to each other real quick, or are we ready to go?
Ready to go.
Okay, so we're recording this, and if you'd use, if you could take, we'll either repeat, if you're up front, I can get you the mic, but I think what we'll ask the panelists to repeat the question so that we make sure we get it right, and I'll just moderate and ask, we have so many experts on this gathered today. It's a brain trust that we have in here. Let's make a little use of it. Who's first? Chuck Howe.
The rebound effect you're talking about is what people in the water management, urban water management, call demand hardening. And they say, well, you really shouldn't engage in water conservation because then when you have a drought, you don't have, it's much more difficult to cut back because you've already cut back. You can't cut back much more. So you're in a region where cutbacks are going to have much more severe effect. The way that's usually posed is much baloney because they overlook the values of the water saved and the other effects that conservation really does have. I wonder how much of the rebound stuff is baloney too, because in the meantime you got a lot more people that have refrigerators, enjoying refrigerators, but see, people don't look at the value side. They just want to look at the technical side.
So let me just ask, Luke, are we able to record a sound like that? No. So we won't get, unless we move a microphone around, we won't get all the questions on the video, so we're going to just ask the responder to paraphrase the question and then have at it.
Okay, I'll paraphrase. Water hardening is is a theory that if you conserve water to a point, and then when the actual drought hits, you can't conserve anymore because you've already conserved as much as you can conserve. And the questioner is posing that that's BS. And I would mostly agree. It's interesting to look at what's happening in the electrical utilities, which is who I've been working with a lot in the last few years. I think the EIA said that this last year, actually in the last 3 years, I think, the consumption curve of kilowatt hours, not kilowatts, but kilowatt hours, which is electrical consumption. These lights are consuming thousands of kilowatt hours right now, has actually flattened and is starting to potentially trend downward. And part of that is the economy, but part of that is energy efficiency as well. And the utilities, what the utilities have been saying is, yeah, we've got all the easy stuff. Now it's just going to be really expensive and really hard. We can't do much more. And it turns out that every year, yeah, you can still find your 1% or 2% reduction every year, and you can keep going. Now, that only goes down to a certain point, right? Because you can't get down to zero. What's really interesting to me is I think in the end, no, I think the rebound effect for the United States, my personal opinion on this is the rebound effect in electricity for the United States is not really all that real. I mean, think about a house. You're not going to put in more lights in your house and install more can lights in your ceiling because LEDs are more efficient than incandescents. That's not going to happen. You're not going to say, all right, I've already got a kitchen, I've already got a refrigerator, it's sized for this space and it can be this tall and it's 10 years old, but this other one's more efficient, let me rip it out and go put this other one in. That doesn't really happen. But where it does happen is in places that aren't already technologically advanced. So Africa, for instance, mid-continent Africa, between South Africa and up to Northern Africa, yes, because of energy efficiency, because of economic efficiencies, you will start to open up those areas to being able to use appliances and things like that where they haven't before. That is, on a global scale, that is probably can be considered an effect of rebound. But on the United States, if you're looking at just United States policy, no, I don't think it's actually something we need to even really think about.
Other comments? Joel Smith.
All right, I'll try to paraphrase. I will not get the eloquence with which that was stated. Joel Smith from Stratus asks, do we need a little bit more subtlety in how we represent this issue that we tend to characterize extreme events as climate change caused everything, or that climate change doesn't exist, and isn't the truth somewhere in the middle? And he says it's hard to believe that with all of the documented evidence of humans causing changes in climate, that it hasn't had some effect on extremes. Is that fair enough? Well, there's a few things to say in response to that. I am, as you know, a big fan of nuance in our discussions, which often gets lost in the media, in politics, but even in our scientific discussions. But I guess I would push back against the idea that the truth is to be found in the middle. If Al Gore says that the turtles that were on the fence once every 1,000 years or once every 1,000 years now, or once every 2 years, you say, well, truth's probably once every 500. It doesn't work that way. And all I can tell you is that when we look at the data that's out there, and the data could be wrong, certainly, and this is a remarkably robust set of findings, as you know, because there's been studies done all around the world. When you look at the data and you count the turtles on the fences, what you find is that you cannot see a secular signal of an increase in the cost of disasters, and for many extremes, even in the physical science aspects of those. Now, there are some for which you can, and I think western forest fires would be a good example. What's called extreme precipitation, which unfortunately we have an English language problem with, because when scientists say extreme precipitation, they're often talking about some end of a distribution or a threshold, 50 millimeters, which has, as we've shown in our work, essentially no relationship to stream flow or damage. Certainly there's been temperature extremes. So what if we're in, here's some nuance for you. What if we have remarkably robust evidence that humans are affecting the climate system, and at the exact same time, we do not see any of that showing up in our statistics on extreme events? Now, on the one hand, you would say, well, that, as you say, logically, that doesn't make sense to me. But logically, I think it does make perfect sense. So let's say you're playing poker, and I have pictures of the dealer changing cards out. He's putting more aces in the deck every other hand. And you would say, I have remarkable evidence that he's changing out the composition of the deck. And the player would say, yeah, but I've played 100 hands. It's 100 years worth of cards. And my statistics don't show, I've only gotten 2 blackjacks. My statistics don't show it. If you're looking for the signal of human-caused climate change, about the worst place you could possibly look is extremes, just by the nature of mathematics and statistics. So we've done a study in which we asked the question, all right, let's take a climate model output for hurricanes and assume it's true, and ask the question, when would we expect to see that signal, either in the physical science statistics of hurricanes or in the disaster losses? And the answer to that question is longer than our lifetimes. So it is perfectly consistent with the science to say we may not see that signal on the timescales. At the same time, we're remarkably robust in our assessment of humans causing climate change. So this is what I kind of, the kind of subtlety I think escapes this debate. But let's take it one step further and talk about it from a practical perspective. The practical question is, so what? Why are we having this debate? We're having this debate, the picture's not up there, but because extreme events are a very powerful and visceral symbol that people respond to, and for some reason, advocates on either side of this politicized debate think that this is where they want to, set their beachhead and fight this battle. It's a losing proposition. I have written in a paper, and I think this is how I would characterize it, that maybe we're playing blackjack and the deck has been changed. But as far as your strategies for betting, a signal that you can't detect cannot be a signal that matters too much for your short-term decision-making. And if we actually care about extreme events, we ought to be focusing on the things that do matter: where we build, how we build, evacuation, building codes, all of those things that modulate disaster impacts on the short term. And I think we in the scientific community have to resist the siren call of jumping into the fray and saying things like, well, the drought this year is perfectly consistent with climate model predictions for the next 100 years. Well, actually, this nice day in Boulder is perfectly consistent with climate model predictions, and there's nothing inconsistent with it. And I think we get ourselves in trouble by going out on a limb and just not saying what the science says. It says what it says. If it changes, we'll change. But the best advice we could give to advocates on this debate is not, I can't see how it could be impacting, but we can't see it, and you probably shouldn't go there.
I've got a couple of hands in the queue, but let me just say that in this, unlike some political discourse or debates or something, we've got some time. If the questioners would also like to jump back in, the first and the second. So give me a signal. There's time to wrestle these ideas a little, and I just realized I wouldn't want it all to be the speaker then gets to respond to the questioner and that's it. So let me know, all right? And I can see the two first questioners aren't right this minute, but feel free. So over here, and then I'm watching then I'm moving to the right. Kathleen. Hmm? Yeah. All three panelists want to respond. So the last question, the last way that Kathleen has phrased the question, isn't it a good idea to, with global warming being difficult to conceive, to bring it to the concrete, and extreme events are concrete, they're on the news, they're on the cover, they're in our lives. There was more to the question of that, but I think all the panelists would like to, and we'll learn more about the nuances as they respond. Kevin seemed ready to go, but Shali, are you on? Okay.
Sure.
Go.
Okay. Okay, well, and so I will have to say, though, before I answer that, obviously this is the DC answer. I am part of American Meteorological Society policy program, and so what I say is, first of all, my personal opinion, don't reflect AMS in any way. More so, this...
Yeah.
But I have to go back
an old
there,
name.
so just remember, I have to go back there.
We're glad you're there and working hard on.
We taught her well.
Yeah.
And I will say this, though, you know, I have my interpretation of what I think is going on at NOAA and at NCDC, and that's what I can share at least. I don't know what Dr. Lubchenco, you know, what her motivations are, you know, but I do know what you're referring to, that she did, you know, talk about the wildfires when she was in Australia recently. She was talking about the wildfires and linking them to climate change and things like that. This is, you know, specifically what I think NOAA and NCDC, the National Climatic Data Center, I think they are trying to deal with this issue. And that's the work that I'm involved in right now specifically, is talking about the narrative around extreme events. And I will be, you know, I personally am charitable in the sense that I think it comes from a good place, that there is the struggle between communicating things to the public and from a scientific point of view to be scientifically accurate about it, but to make it tangible, to what people can reflect. And, we have an added component in DC that we're also working with decision makers and trying to convey a lot of this information to the Hill and to the agencies and things like that. And they're, I would say, a subset of the public. So there's an issue there, I think, of trying to make it tangible, but there is a larger issue, especially if I think about representing the scientific community, of staying accurate to what is reflected, what is evidence-based versus what is a projection, with, what I was mentioning, the concern of misinformation can possibly lead to poor policies down the road. So when you're looking at extreme events and, kind of to mention something to what Roger was saying, we're worried about that because the impact is large, and the concern is if this continues, we're worried about the well-being of society. There are people that want to politicize this, but there is a greater societal concern there that's kind of motivating us to look at these issues. But how do you solve that problem? I mean, that's what the decision maker, that's what the policy maker is trying to do, trying to find the root of the problem and figure out how to solve it. When you link it to climate change, maybe sometimes unfairly so, and that's what I tried to say with trying to take individual weather events that are happening, the Joplin tornado, and not looking at the climate record for it and trying to link one event to climate change. That's a misrepresentation. It might be the case if you look at 30 years of or 30 plus years of Joplin type tornadoes taking place, but to link something like that is kind of an apples and oranges scale. And if that outcome comes out as, there's a link there, then it automatically points the policymaker to the problem being climate change. And, there's an issue of looking at kind of the range of problems that could be, resilience and exposure and things like that, that might have led to things more so. I think misinformation can lead to poor policies down the road, and that's what my concern is trying to solve that problem in an appropriate way, and also to stay accurate to it as scientists, to be able to say, this is what we see, this is what we project, this is what we anticipate, this is what we can see by counting all the turtles on the fence. So that would be my take on it.
Go ahead, quick. Keep moving.
I appreciate, Kathleen, I appreciate the comment. I think it's definitely true. I think my quick answer is we need to keep trying, and try harder to educate people as to what we want them to know and think about. But I think we get down a slippery slope if we start to say, well, you ain't getting it, so I'm going to just illustrate it for you in a different way that may not be fully scientifically accurate. I think the problem is we have a cultural divide that is not talked about very much, but is very plainly obvious to me that most people don't think like scientists, and the amount of the percentage of scientists in society is minuscule. We're pretty different from most people, and there is a bit of a credibility gap. And if we stretch that gap, that's going to be a bad thing in the end. So I think we need to avoid that as much as possible. And I've been reading my go-to book right now is Dan Kamen's Thinking Fast and Slow. I don't know if anybody's read that yet or picked it up. That's a great book. It kind of encapsulates his entire career of thinking, and it's beautiful. And I think if we all read that and probably read it 3 or 4 times in the next year, and then really kind of thought about all those messages in there, and then sort of started putting it into practice, we might be able to start getting down that road. In the end, it may be an unsolvable problem, and we may just have to accept that.
You mean the perceptions might not be fixable?
What's unsolvable to me, perhaps, and I'm not saying it definitely is unsolvable, is how do you get people to think about things that are not right in front of their faces? I mean, that's one of his points in the book. I love this term, what you see is what you get, or sorry, what you see is all there is. That's is one of his phrases in the book. What you see is all there is, and it's how most people think. Like if I'm given a bunch of evidence, or if I'm given a case, and I'm told I'm biasing you. I'm told by the presenter of the case, I'm definitely biasing you. Just want you to know I'm biasing your opinion by giving you some misleading information. They will still, even knowing that they're being misled, will still side with, go towards the direction that the presenter wants them to go. Sorry, there's so many complicated things in that book, and they're all running through my head that it's hard to articulate them all. But read the book.
Yeah, read the book.
And come back to me tomorrow.
Thinking Fast and Slow.
I'm going to pass it to Roger.
Roger, and then we'll...
Yeah, Kathleen, that's a great question. That gets to the nub of the issue here. And what you're really asking is, do the ends justify the means? And this gets, goes back a long time. And yeah, the late Steve Schneider had a famous quote that is often truncated, but he said, with respect to the climate issue, we each, as scientists, have to come up with the right balance between being truthful and being effective. And he said he hopes that means being both. But people make that trade-off in different ways. Let me say, in response to your comment, as far as what Greenpeace says, or the Heartland Institute, or interest groups on either side, we live in an open society. People can say whatever nonsense they want, and they'll probably be countered by that. I hold institutions like NOAA to a different standard. NOAA is just not a run-of-the-mill advocacy group out there. They're supposed to be the brain trust, in some respects, of our society. They're supposed to have the best information possible. I'll give you an analogy that I often use when people raise this question. So after 9/11, the US government decided that it was a good idea to invade Iraq. It turns out that the government was pushing the idea that Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein had an alliance, and maybe there was nuclear weapons that were being sent from the WMDs in Iraq to Al-Qaeda. And Condoleezza Rice went on Good Morning America and famously said, the next signal we get from Al-Qaeda is a mushroom cloud over New York City. The response to that, and after history has shown what the data actually showed, was that, well, Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, and most Americans actually thought there was a connection. So why didn't we just push on that as a way of being effective? So what if it wasn't true? Saddam was still bad. That was true. And so if we say on climate change, well, yeah, climate change is really important. And who cares if people think that this drought was climate change? More power to them. Maybe we can convince them more readily. At the core of this is something that I would call, and this is strong language, but fundamentally anti-democratic and authoritarian, about our experts saying, you citizens are too stupid to understand this issue. We know what's best, so we are going to intentionally give you misinformation, whether it's Al-Qaeda and the Iraq War or climate change, in order to try to compel you to do something that we think is best. And one of the things that I've come to conclude is that if you really believe in democracy, and it's not clear everybody does, but it means that people have the right to make bad decisions, where bad decisions are decisions at odds to what the experts would do. I think if we go down a path where we start saying that, yeah, what Dick Cheney did was okay, what Jane Lubchenco is doing in NOAA right now is okay, you're pretty much saying that anything goes. And that as long as we know what the right decision is, it doesn't matter what information you array before it. So I would say NOAA's job is to play it straight, not to engage in campaigning and trying to convince people of certain political actions. And if the information NOAA puts out, if they happen to say, well, gee, US drought has actually improved over the last century, that's what the data says. I'm of the school of thought that the debate over the science of climate change is actually a complete non-starter as far as getting action on energy policy. So just being in that space, we're making the problem worse. But that's a different panel, I think.
So I suggested that those who raise questions could come back if they wish. Not to put you on the spot, but you poked the panel and got a response there, Kathleen. And you mentioned Leiserowicz's work, and the Yale surveys included a recent result this summer that people are too easily impressed with events showing trends. And I guess that's the point that you just made. They're not scientists, but we can't make them into scientists. If we're the scientists, we just have to stick with our, well, I'm just rambling. I know that I had a question over here, and then I had this person. If you're still wanting to be on the queue, you can, or I can pass you. Okay, go.
What would constitute extreme climate event? Is there even such a thing as a climate event?
Yeah, and so, my concern is this linking what we see as an actual weather event, a tornado that comes through, or flood, and linking that specific individual event to climate change. So a climate event, the way I think NOAA is looking at it, is these long-term, you know, show me 30 years of tornadoes that are doing that. That would be the extreme, the climate extremes that, you know, they're talking about. The trend over period of how these, you know, weather events look, you know, decade after decade over a long period of time. That would be a climate event, not individual events. Yeah. Right. Right. It is, and
There are some
I think that there is a distinction. I mean, I think, you know, that's what I was trying to say, is that there's so much confusion across the board in the way we're presenting the ideas. But the idea I think they have is pretty clear in the sense that they are trying to look from the climate perspective, they're trying to look at decades worth of, you know, the evidence of what's been playing out with, you know, with these types of different disaster phenomena. So you're right, it's not events, it is the trend, the long-term record in it. Whether events are specific, you know, specific events that happen, you know, over a period of 2 days or something like that.
Do you think a careful lay observer could notice a trend over several decades in tornado frequency if they were just careful? A lay observer could observe these subtle trends in events over time? Yeah,
And
that's
I would just
probably
add
right.
also, I mean, and that's why I think there's a little bit of difficulty with the SREX report, because they also are talking about climate extremes / they use the term climate events. And so it gets confusing then, but the idea is not events, but, you know, the long-term record on how, you know, these disaster phenomena play out.
And I know Randy wants to jump in on this issue, but I'll stick with the queue because patience is a virtue, and take on. We're on the first 4 hands still. Well, okay, well, patience is.
I'm really struck, especially from the Roger's point, about how we need to think about the wrong question. Roger can make the case, is we know that these are true events so far, but it strikes me that even if between now and 2040 there is, we're looking at climate, who cares? And Jim points out, I know there's this whole debate among energy economists,
Rebound.
Rebound. Right. But again, why do we actually care? Because none of that sort of informs the question. Policy at the time. You know, important. You know, the Department of Energy has a program to unbind low-income housing. I don't know if that makes a net decrease in energy consumption, but I know a lot of poor people have a lot more comfort than they otherwise would because of it. So go do it, and don't worry about it. And I know that the better we can prepare for extreme events, which is climate change now, the better off we are. You know, no more countries in the United States, much less which is Central America. And whether there's 10% more hurricanes or, you know, 3% reduction or not in total energy consumption, who cares? I mean, the real question of policy is addressing the needs, and by focusing too much on whether energy consumption decreases or whether we all signals or what is the data, it takes us away from what we actually need.
Yeah, several assertions and questions implied in that. Can you just, and also briefly restate it if you...
Yeah, Frank Laird from Denver, with his usual concise wisdom, says, who cares about this debate over extreme events? And I agree with you 100%, because think about it this way. Let's say we had a magic knob, and we turned carbon dioxide to 350 parts per million overnight. By when do you think we would be able to detect the change in that signal in extreme events? I mean, the answer is it's going to be a lot longer than detecting the signal that I just mentioned, which is, you know, centuries. Carbon dioxide is not a control knob on the disasters that we face. So we're in the wrong space. And for a long time, I've said that the policies that are going to be impacted most directly by this incessant focus on extreme events are not going to be energy policies. They're going to be our science policies, the integrity of our institutions, is what's going to be at risk. And it's a little bit, I don't know what the right metaphor is, but you're smashing a glass vase against a wall, hoping you're going to break down the wall. And science and scientific authority and scientific integrity are much more fragile than this big, broad debate over energy policy. And if we keep trying to break down that wall, it's not going to be the wall that suffers the consequences. So I agree, and that's the risk.
Kevin, you're okay. You're moving to the mic.
I think, yeah, I agree. I agree about the who cares part. On the energy efficiency side, I was, in my mind, I started to push back a little bit and think, actually, it does matter because you've got a lot of intersecting and competing interests here, and you've got a lot of it's probably your mic.
Go ahead. Speak into that.
You've got a lot of kind of economic forcings that push against each other. But then I was thinking, well, actually, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to make the economy more efficient. And if you're trying to make the economy more efficient, and one of your ways is try to make energy more efficient, energy use more efficient, great, go to do it. And the pushback on the government regulation side, the anti-government regulation side, is just that. It's just saying, get out of our shorts, government. Don't tell us to be more efficient. We'll be more efficient if we want to be more efficient. And that's really the values that are laying behind the debate. So, yeah, I agree.
Randy. So I want to respond, Shali, is we would define the 2012 Texas drought, which had to be beyond Texas and beyond 2011 and 12, but as a weather event or a climate event.
Yeah. So droughts are particularly difficult, and I will say that in the past, every time I've had to work with weather data, I leave droughts out conveniently because they're a difficult one to deal. So that's the easy answer to it. Obviously, that's the easy answer to it. You know, it's, again, you know, there's so much power in the wording of it, and I think that's a lot of how we operate. The 2011 drought event was a weather event, but was the drought a 2011 event? No, there was a lot of lead up to that. I personally don't consider that an annual event of 2011 because, you know, it was building up for a very long time. I don't think droughts in general are discrete events, you know, and that's what makes them so difficult. So, and the 2012 event, is that a different drought event than the 2011 drought event? Droughts are very complicated. They are sometimes considered as weather events. I personally think that they should be more climatological events.
Randy's holding the floor because he said multiple questions were coming. I wish I could.
If you look at I completely agree. If you look at 2011, is this on? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, if you look at the 2011 drought, yes, it was the 12-month drought of record. If you look at it over a 5-year period, it fits right in the middle of the distribution. So that is, it's not a sustained drought. It was basically a 1-year drought. So the reason I asked that question, depending on your answer, arguably, again, on the first slide, you had the billion-dollar disasters. NOAA made a lot of a record number of billion-dollar disasters. Arguably, every one of those was a weather event by some other criterion we put forward in terms of trends. So it's a challenge. Now we have Dr. Lubchenco saying we can connect the dots.
between these kinds of events and climate change, which comes out as kind of an attribution statement that
Yeah.
I would say from a public perception that these events in some sense are caused by climate change. I guess the third part of the background is I just got back from Oxford in the last week having co-chaired a meeting on attribution of climate extremes. So I've been doing a lot of work in this area for some time, and I would just say that it is an exceedingly difficult problem to make attribution. There are areas where various approaches are being developed. Susan Avery was saying to me on that if we look at the long-term trends in relatively extreme warm versus cold temperatures, either on a daily time scale or on a seasonal, then you see a change in the statistics of those consistent with the warming planet. But once you go beyond that, daily precipitation extremes, again, as Roger said, don't tend to translate into floods, and so that's why the 2011 floods, it's hard to make an attribution statement without a lot of hard scientific work. But that is not always done in NOAA before these kinds of statements are made. So having put that very long context into place, has NOAA done an optimal job in communicating what we really can say about extreme events and climate change?
Take it away, panelists. Shali
yeah, go
first,
ahead.
I guess. Or you bring it to her?
I just have a brief, the difficult news for the scientific community is that you don't own the word climate anymore. The word climate has been a very potent political symbol. It means a lot of things, but it doesn't mean what it meant when I first read Lamb and Shagnon and others. It's not 30-year statistics of weather anymore. The nearest I can come up to this is what the medical research community had to experience with stem cell research. Stem cell research used to be a jargony term, and it became a political term. So this is where NOAA, and it's not just NOAA, but it's others, the usage of the term gets a little bit coy sometimes because it means different things. Even the term climate change, which used to mean, the IPCC used to define it as any change in climate over long time periods on a kind of a continuum. The Framework Convention on Climate Change defines it narrowly as the effects of greenhouse gases on our climate system. So even that the term itself doesn't have a single meaning, and it's not going to be determined by the scientific community, which is a little bit frightening because when you put it in a scientific paper, you can almost be sure that it's going to be misinterpreted from how you intend it. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Other responses?
Yeah, I would just say that I agree with you completely that attribution is a very difficult thing to do, and it's a very important thing if you're going to do it. And so that's my concern is, to cross over into that, especially in this political spectrum, to make those connections. You need a lot of hard evidence to be able to do that, and I don't think we're there yet. So that's my biggest concern, is to make those links. I don't have a problem, though, with wording the message in a different way. And that, to me, is all I think that this needs to be, which is why I say from a policy perspective, I don't think, at least our point for being the scientific community conveying that information, I don't think it's so difficult to say, we can anticipate that this might be the case, but we don't see that yet. It's, to me, the message that you're conveying is half the battle, and those are being very specific in your words to stay true to what is out there right now versus what you anticipate. If you can draw that line, which I don't think is a difficult line to draw, a lot of these problems go away, and to me that's an easy fix, but we just need to see that play out.
I think there's some confusion of present and future tense.
Yeah, absolutely, and evidence-based versus projection. Yeah. Yeah, and especially for the scientific community, if, to think about evidence-based science versus projection, if that's one message that, I can make clear, I think that would make bounds of progress for us.
So one bit of context. I want to throw out some context just as something to think about. We've really kind of keyed in terms of extremes and all this stuff, we've really keyed in on the weather and climate stuff. I like to say, all right, you've got hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, droughts, all that stuff, and you've got it all wrapped up in this debate about climate change and all that stuff. So just hold that and then hold next to it earthquakes, which we have no control over, yet they still cause extremes and extreme disasters. And when I'm thinking about public policy responses to these different things, I'm thinking, should the public policy responses to all the weather-based disasters be any different than to earthquake disasters? I mean, maybe yes and maybe no. I would say probably not. But if not, then why do we even talk about all this stuff? Why do we even care about attribution? Is the point to talk about our extremes and how we deal with very rare but very catastrophic events, or is the point to get all wrapped around the axle about attribution of climate events?
Okay.
A couple things, and this is again where the conflation can occur. One is the distinction between climate variations, and I would certainly say that a seasonal or a one-year event could pretty clearly fall within the context of a climate variation. And I think the public sometimes confuses, and I think maybe scientists as well, variations from changes. And that actually does have implications, because if something is going to go away, that's quite different than if it's a secular trend that is going to continue and increase. And then just the point on thinking fast and slow, and that is that we have a profound human need to explain, to come to an explanation as one of the key points. And for extremes, as you properly said, there are often quite a number of factors that happen to come together, but it's easier to do that after the fact than anticipate. So part of the purpose of attribution, in my view, in fact, is to say what we might say about the future as well, not just about what happened, but what implications that may convey.
I just want to say, when Randy came over to the center to do a seminar on attribution, he asked me, well, what level should I pitch it at? And I suggested, do it at your level and we'll try to keep up, because that was important for us. And it was a great seminar. We could use it again, the details. So we'll try to get that again. We'll try to get Randy back and try to get into the details and the stats and the challenges and the type 1 and the type 2 errors of this issue. Lisa's on, and we've got just a couple more minutes. Yeah, if that might, then they won't read.
I think you guys have made a great case for, well, I agree with a lot of the things that have been said. I think one of the reasons we actually focus on attribution is because people are using extremes as a justification to get people to take action on the mitigation side, if you will, on the emission side. That's the real reason that people are using it politically. However, I just want to make a point to Carl's point in the back about being able, can people really detect changes and changes over time? And there's something we haven't talked about at all much yet, but there's a lot of changes in the biological system, things like timing of birds hatching, things like, when do the swallows return to X area, that actually are observed by the public and people interpret in their own ways, but they're also backed up by science. There's also, I've spoken to a lot of different people who say, well, when I was a kid in this area, XYZ happened with the weather. Now it seems like X other thing is happening with the weather. And they're not saying it's climate change themselves, but I think we have to remember this is a conversation not between just agencies and scientists and the media, but there's average citizens out there, the public is out there interpreting their own experiences in their daily lives, thinking about what's going on, and they can actually interpret some of this. So I think scientists have a great responsibility to say, well, here's what we can actually say scientifically, but at the same time, there's also people coming with their own interpretations, and some of them are backed up by science, and some of them maybe are not. I know we've had this conversation, but just that was, I guess, not really a question, but I mean, you can actually respond if you want or not.
We can take one more question. I think you're responding, Roger, or Kristen was in the queue, I think, and then.
Yeah, so it was interesting, Kevin, that you brought up earthquakes, because I was thinking about the Lacerowitz study, and about 60% of the U.S. public believes that the Texas drought was...
Speak right into that.
I am? Yeah. Is it? Okay. It believes that the Texas drought was caused or exacerbated by climate change, but about 45% of the U.S. population believes that the earthquake back east was also caused or exacerbated by climate change. And so, although, and that's in that same study, so I think it's, even though we can kind of use droughts and other extreme events as focusing events, I think we have to recognize that when we're having these very nuanced physical science discussions, in some ways we're splitting hairs. The other thing that I kind of wanted to tee off was something you said, Roger, about the responsibility of the agencies. And also, Lisa just said, as physical scientists, we're trying to figure out how can we develop the best science? How can we do what Randy's doing to really enhance predictability by looking at attribution and looking at what's causing these specific individual events? But I think about the Russian heat wave. Our science papers, there are about 12 different papers that span the spectrum in terms of what they said, attributing the event to climate change or to natural variability. And you had 12 different press releases coming out. The Texas drought, right now, we have a paper coming out of NOAA, as well as one out of NASA, and another one that I just learned about out of DOE, that have, again, 3 different messages. One saying, I would say the headlines will read, caused by climate change. The other one will say, not caused by climate change. So I'm kind of curious about your perspectives on how we reconcile among the agencies as well as among scientists, because this is really scientific discourse that's just playing out in the public. And so what are our responsibilities as perhaps federal scientists and as agencies for kind of reconciling these issues? Sorry, lots of stuff there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great.
Take that and we'll wrap up.
Yep. Let me just say quickly, that's a great question. And I mean, if you want to expand uncertainty on a particular topic, at least in the short term, fund more scientific research with people from different perspectives, because you'll get those 12 different studies. The idea that science needs to speak with one voice gets us in trouble sometimes. But I think the scientific community would do itself a favor by developing a sophisticated capacity to be able to put scientific findings into policy context. And what that means is, in the context of drought, the actions that make sense with respect to responding to drought are remarkably robust to the variations you see in those 12 studies. Call up Kathleen and have her be a part of the study. We have this idea, and I think this comes from the IPCC version, that this mythology that you move from you're pretty sure to you're really certain to it's lock solid, locked down. And science doesn't always move in that way. And then the idea is that you move in that direction, and that tells us what we have to do. It's perfectly fine that we have different studies about health. Every day coffee causes cancer. No, it lengthens your life, whatever. We have all sorts of studies about the state of the agricultural system. Yeah, we have plenty of food. No, we don't have enough food. Climate change is no different than any other area of science. You look at the economy. I mean, what's consensus on what we ought to be doing in the economy? We don't have it. So we had to give up this image of get scientific certainty, policy proceeds. And NOAA could do this by trying less hard to be a participant in the big political debate with a single message, billion-dollar disasters, and simply saying, look, science is complicated, and if you want to talk about policy, we can do that, but the science is just one of many factors. That reduces NOAA's visibility and their asserted importance, which is contrary to political appointees, but it's a much more honest approach, I think, to the role of science in decision-making.
Last words, Kevin. If you wish, you can pass.
I'll pass to Shali.
Oh.
Okay,
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think that, this is a room full of scientists that are engaged in this issue or in relevant things. And so, I would just encourage everybody to kind of think of some of these issues and, think about how to proceed forward in a way that we can all contribute to trying to have a good, accurate, useful conversation about these things, going forward.
That's the goal of the center, among other things. And we appreciate you spending some time celebrating our 10th anniversary, which will carry on in 30 minutes. We have snacks upstairs in the Heritage Center. We'll be back here. There's the program for the day. And let's thank our panelists and take a break.